The old stone castle stood tall against the morning sky. Its walls carried the memory of many years, and its halls were filled with silence and stories. Queen Alara walked slowly through the grand chamber, her crown resting with quiet weight upon her head. Her steps were graceful, yet heavy with the knowledge that time was moving past her. She had ruled for long years, her wisdom guiding her people through trials, but she knew her strength was fading. She looked upon her daughter, Princess Marin, with pride and a touch of sorrow. Marin was young, her hair like fire in the sunlight, and her spirit as strong as steel. That morning, a soldier entered the castle. His name was Ethan, and though he was young, his face already showed the marks of battle and hardship. He was called not only for his skill with the sword, but for the strength that lay within his heart. Did not know why he had been chosen, but he felt the air of destiny pressing upon him as he stepped into the presence of the queen. His eyes lowered in respect, yet curiosity pulled at him when he saw the princess standing behind her mother. Queen Alara spoke, her voice soft but steady. She told Ethan that her years had made her too ancient for him, but her daughter awaited him. Her words were not of romance, but of something greater, something woven by fate. Ethan listened, confused yet drawn to the meaning hidden within her whisper. Marin's eyes met his for only a moment, and in that brief look, he felt the stir of something he could not name. It was not the gaze of a princess waiting to be saved, but the look of a warrior ready to fight. The days that followed, Ethan remained within the castle. He trained in the courtyards, his blade clashing against Marin's. The sound of steel rang out beneath the high walls, and the two grew to know each other not through words but through the rhythm of battle. Marin fought with speed and precision, her every move sharp and fierce. Ethan held his ground, steady and unyielding, learning her patterns and matching her fire with his calm strength. Together, they pushed each other to limits they had not known before. Queen Alara watched from the high balconies. She saw her daughter's spirit grow brighter, and she saw Ethan rise to meet her. She knew the truth that time had whispered to her for years. Her rule was nearing its end, and the kingdom's future would not rest in her hands. It would belong to Marin and to the soldier who had come into their lives at the turning of the seasons. Her heart carried both pride and sadness, for though she longed to protect her daughter, she understood that every crown must pass. Ethan did not fully understand the weight of what was happening, but he felt it in his heart. When he looked at the queen, he saw not only a ruler, but a mother preparing her child for the world. When he looked at Marin, he saw not only a princess, but a partner who carried her own fire. There was no gentle story between them, no soft words exchanged in secret. What grew between them was forged in strength, in the clash of blades, and in the quiet respect that grew with every strike. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the stones in gold, Ethan stood in the courtyard, his breath heavy after another round of training. Marin lowered her blade, her hair loose from its braid, her eyes sharp yet thoughtful. She spoke then, not as a princess, but as someone who wished to know the truth. She asked him why he stayed, why he fought beside her when he owed her nothing. Ethan looked at her, his voice simple and steady. He said he stayed because something told him this was where he was meant to be. Marin did not smile, but her silence was answer enough. Queen Alara, watching from the shadows of the hall, let out a quiet breath. The path was unfolding just as it was meant to. And though her own days grew shorter, she knew her daughter's future was being built with each passing hour. The whisper she had spoken was no longer only her secret. It had begun to shape the destiny of them all. The days turned into weeks, and the bond between Ethan and Marin grew stronger with every passing moment. They trained in the courtyards from sunrise to sunset, the clash of their blades echoing through the stone walls. The soldiers of the castle began to gather at the edges to watch, for it was not just training, but a dance of strength and will. Ethan learned to match Marin's speed, and Marin grew steadier through Ethan's calm presence. Together they became sharper, stronger, and more connected. One morning, Marin challenged Ethan to follow her beyond the castle walls. She led him through the old forest paths, where sunlight filtered through the tall trees. She spoke little, but when she did, her words carried weight. She told him of her childhood, of the years spent preparing for war, of the lessons her mother had pressed into her heart. She said she had always been ready to fight, but she had never trusted another to stand beside her. Ethan listened without interruption, his silence steady and respectful. In that silence, Marin felt something she had never known before. She felt seen. As they walked deeper into the woods, they came upon a clearing. There stood an old statue of a king who had long passed into history. The stone was worn, but the strength of his face still remained. Marin placed her hand upon the statue and spoke of legacy. She told Ethan that every ruler left behind something greater than themselves. Her mother had told her this truth many times. Now, as she looked at Ethan, she wondered if her own story was beginning to take shape in ways she had not expected. Ethan felt the weight of her words. He had come to the castle as a soldier, nothing more, yet now he felt something shifting inside him. He was not simply fighting battles with Marin. He was becoming part of something larger, something that would outlive both of them. He reached out and placed his hand on the same stone, and though he spoke no words, Marin understood what he meant. He was ready to stand with her, wherever the path led. Queen Alara remained within the castle, but her thoughts were often with the two. She knew that her choice to bring Ethan into their lives had begun to shape the future of the kingdom. She felt the ache of time in her bones, yet she carried no fear. She trusted Marin, and now she trusted Ethan as well. In her private chambers, she wrote letters to her council, preparing them for the day when she would no longer sit upon the throne. Her heart carried both sorrow and peace, for though she would fade, the kingdom would endure. One night, Marin and Ethan stood upon the walls of the castle, the stars stretching endless above them. The wind carried the chill of the coming storm, but neither moved away. Marin spoke of duty, of how she had been raised to believe that her life belonged not to herself, but to the kingdom. She admitted that at times she had felt like a prisoner within her own crown. Ethan listened and then told her that strength was not in carrying the burden alone, but in allowing another to carry it with you. Marin turned to him, and for the first time, she allowed her guard to fall, even if only for a moment. The days of quiet training ended when news reached the castle. Riders brought word of enemies gathering beyond the borders, of armies preparing to march upon the kingdom. The queen gathered her council, and Marin stood beside her mother, her armor shining beneath the torchlight. Ethan was called to join, his presence now no longer as an outsider, but as part of the kingdom's defense. The people looked to him not only as a soldier, but as a man chosen by fate to fight beside their princess. In the quiet of the night, before the first battle horn sounded, Ethan walked through the halls of the castle. He paused at the great doors of the throne room and stepped inside. Queen Alara was there, seated upon the throne with her crown casting shadows in the dim light. She looked at him with eyes that carried both age and wisdom. She reminded him of her first words, that she was too ancient for him, but her daughter awaited him. She told him that destiny was not always chosen, but accepted. Ethan bowed his head and promised he would not fail. In that moment, he felt the weight of not only his own life, but the fate of the kingdom resting upon his shoulders. When he left the throne room, Marin was waiting for him in the corridor, her sword at her side, her expression steady. She said nothing, but the look in her eyes told him everything. The time for training had ended. The time for battle had come. The dawn came with a restless wind, carrying the sound of distant drums. The kingdom stirred with unease, for the shadow of war had drawn near. Soldiers gathered at the gates, their armor shining in the weak light of morning. Ethan stood among them, his sword ready, his face calm, but his heart heavy with the weight of what was to come. He had fought in battles before, but this time felt different. This was not only a fight for survival, it was a fight for the future of a people who had taken him into their trust. Princess Marin rode beside him, her armor fitted with care, her eyes steady. She had grown even sharper in spirit since the days of training. The soldiers who followed her looked to her as more than a leader. They saw her as a symbol, a flame that could guide them through the dark. Ethan glanced at her as they rode out together, and he felt the bond between them deepen without the need for words. Behind the walls, Queen Alara watched as her daughter and the soldier led the troops toward the open fields. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the railing of the balcony. She had been through many battles in her life, but this time she remained behind. She was no longer the sword of the kingdom. She was its memory, its wisdom, its fading strength. Her trust now lay in Marin and Ethan. She whispered a quiet prayer, not to the gods, but to the courage that lived in both of them. The battlefield stretched wide beneath the gray sky. The enemy forces moved like waves, their banners snapping in the cold air. Ethan stood firm at Merrin's side, his blade reflecting the pale light. When the horns sounded, the clash began. Steel rang against steel, cries of battle filled the air, and the ground shook with the weight of men. Ethan fought with steady skill, his movements precise, his focus unbroken. Merrin was fired beside him, her strikes fast and fierce, her courage driving back those who dared to stand against her. Together they moved as one, their blades crossing, their steps in rhythm, each protecting the other without thought. The soldiers who saw them were lifted by their strength. They fought harder, believing that as long as Merrin and Ethan stood, the kingdom would not fall. The battle raged through the day, the sun hidden behind heavy clouds, the ground stained by the fight. As the hours passed, Ethan began to feel the strain in his arms, but he pushed forward. Merrin's determination never faltered, and her presence gave him strength. They fought side by side until the horns of retreat sounded from the enemy lines. The opposing army pulled back into the hills, leaving silence to settle over the field. The kingdom's forces had held, but the day had left its mark. Many had fallen, and the weight of loss hung heavy in the air. That night, in the quiet camp beyond the battlefield, Ethan sat by the fire, his hands still trembling from the fight. Merrin approached, her face weary, but her eyes still burning with resolve. She sat beside him, neither speaking at first. The silence between them was not empty, but filled with the bond that had grown stronger in the fire of battle. At last Merrin told him that he had stood as more than a soldier, that he had fought as though the kingdom were already his own. Ethan said he had not thought of himself at all, only of her and the people who needed them both. In the distance, Queen Elira's banners still flew above the castle walls. She had received word of the victory, though she knew it was only the beginning. More battles would come, and her time was running thin, yet she felt peace settle within her. She had seen her daughter lead, and she had seen Ethan rise beside her. The path was becoming clear, and the kingdom had hoped once more. Before the fires of the camp dimmed, Merrin rose and placed her hand upon Ethan's shoulder. She told him quietly that the fight had only begun, but she believed in him. Ethan met her eyes, and in that moment words were not needed. He knew he had found not only his place in the kingdom, but also the purpose he had been searching for all his life. The days after the first battle were heavy with both hope and sorrow. The kingdom had held its ground, but the enemy was not defeated. Scouts brought word that the enemy was gathering again, stronger and larger than before. The camp was filled with the sound of hammers striking metal as soldiers repaired their armor and sharpened their blades. The fires burned late into the night, and whispers of fear spread among the men, yet when Merrin walked among them, their fear lessened. Her presence reminded them that they still had something worth fighting for. Ethan stayed close to Merrin, his role no longer only that of a soldier. He was trusted as her equal, someone who stood beside her in council as much as in battle. Together they planned with the captains, speaking of strategies, marking maps with careful thought. Merrin was bold, ready to strike, while Ethan often reminded her of patience and timing. They did not always agree, but their differences made their plans stronger. Those who watched them began to see that the two were not only partners in war, but something greater. Queen Elira remained in the castle, but her strength grew weaker with each passing day. She could no longer walk the halls as she once did, so she sat by the windows, watching the banners rise and fall with the wind. She knew the kingdom rested now on the shoulders of her daughter and the young man who had come into their lives. In her heart she felt both pride and sorrow, for she longed to see the peace that would follow, but she feared she would not live long enough to witness it. On the eve of the second battle, Merrin and Ethan walked together along the edge of the camp. The sky was dark, filled with stars, the air heavy with the silence before war. Merrin spoke of her fears, something she rarely shared. She told Ethan that though she had been raised for battle, she was afraid of losing the people she loved. Ethan listened, and then told her that true courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to stand in spite of it. His words stayed with her, and for the first time she allowed herself to lean on him, not as a princess, but as a person. The next day, the horn sounded once more, and the soldiers marched out to meet the enemy. The field was filled with dust and shouts, the clash of steel rising into the sky. Ethan and Merrin fought side by side again, their movements flowing together as though they were one. The enemy pressed hard, their numbers great, but Merrin's courage and Ethan's steadiness gave strength to those around them. The battle raged long into the night, and though the kingdom soldiers stood firm, the cost was heavy. Last, the enemy fell back once again, retreating into the hills. The field was littered with the fallen, and the air carried the smell of smoke and blood. Merrin stood with her sword lowered, her face marked with both triumph and sorrow. Ethan placed a hand upon her shoulder, steadying her as she took in the sight of what had been lost. They had won, but victory had not come without pain. When they returned to the castle, the people greeted them as heroes. The banners flew high, and songs were sung in their honor. Yet inside the castle, Queen Alara's time was slipping away. She welcomed them into her chamber, her face pale, but her eyes still bright. She told them that the kingdom was strong because of them, and that her trust had not been misplaced. She spoke softly, reminding Ethan of her first words, that she was too ancient for him, but her daughter awaited him.
Oh.
Then she looked at Merrin, and said that the crown would soon rest upon her head. That night, Merrin sat by her mother's side, holding her hand. Ethan stood nearby, silent, his heart heavy. He could see the end drawing near, and though he had not known the queen long, he felt the depth of her wisdom and the weight of her love for her daughter. As the torches flickered and the night stretched on, Queen Alara closed her eyes and whispered blessings for the future. Her voice was faint, but her words carried the strength of a lifetime. In the quiet that followed, Merrin turned to Ethan, her eyes filled with both grief and resolve. She told him that the kingdom would endure, and that they would carry her mother's legacy forward. Ethan nodded, and together they stood in the dim light, ready to face whatever came next. The queen's reign was ending, but a new chapter had begun. The morning after Queen Alara's passing was quiet. The castle felt heavy, its walls carrying the silence of grief. Yet even in sorrow, the people knew a new chapter had begun. Banners were lowered in mourning, and bells rang across the land. Merrin stood in the great hall, her armor polished, her crown placed upon her head for the first time. Her eyes were steady, though her heart still ached. She was now queen, and the weight of her mother's crown pressed upon her with a force she had long known would come. Ethan stood at her side, his hand resting upon the hilt of his sword. He felt the change in the air, the shift of time that marked the end of one reign and the beginning of another. He remembered the queen's words, how she had told him that she was too ancient for him, but her daughter awaited him.
Oh.
Now those words lived fully in his heart. He was no longer only a soldier. He was a protector, a partner, and a man whose fate was bound to the new queen. The kingdom did not have much time to rest. The enemy, though driven back, had not been destroyed. Scouts reported that they were gathering once again, preparing for one final attempt to take the land. Merrin listened to the news with calm resolve. She called her captains, she looked to Ethan, and together they formed a plan. The people needed not only strength, they needed hope, and Merrin swore that she would give them both. As the days passed, the castle prepared for war once more. Smiths worked day and night, the sound of their hammers echoing across the courtyards. Soldiers trained in the fields, their voices rising in unison as they prepared for the march. Merrin walked among them, speaking to each with words of courage, while Ethan drilled them with patience and discipline. Together they balanced one another, fire and calm, boldness and reason. When the day of battle came, the kingdom's army marched to the open plains. The sky was gray, the air heavy, as though the world itself knew what was at stake. Moran rode at the front, her crown gleaming above her helm, her sword drawn. Ethan rode beside her, his shield ready, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Behind them stretched the soldiers of the kingdom, their steps strong, their spirits lifted by the sight of their queen and her chosen companion. The enemy appeared in the distance, a dark line moving across the hills. Horns sounded, banners rose, and the clash began. The field erupted in chaos, the sound of steel and cries filling the air. Merrin fought with the fire of her youth, striking with precision and courage. Ethan fought with steady strength, his shield protecting those around him, his blade cutting through the lines. Together, they became the heart of the battle, their presence driving their soldiers forward. As the fight grew fierce, Merrin found herself surrounded, the enemy pressing hard. Ethan saw and broke through the lines to reach her. Side by side they stood, their blades flashing in the storm of war. They defended each other, their movements in perfect rhythm, until the tide began to turn. The soldiers, seeing their queen and Ethan unyielding, pushed forward with renewed strength. The enemy faltered, their lines broke, and soon they fled across the fields. When the dust settled and the field grew quiet, the kingdom had won. The enemy was scattered, their threat ended. Meryn lowered her sword, her breath heavy, her face streaked with the marks of battle. Ethan stood beside her, his armor dented, his body weary, but his spirit unbroken. Together they looked across the field, knowing that the kingdom was safe, at least for now. They returned to the castle as victors, but their triumph was not only in battle, it was in the bond they had forged, in the trust they had built, in the legacy they now carried forward. Meryn stood before her people in the great hall, the crown upon her head, her voice steady as she promised to rule with strength and justice. Ethan stood beside her, not as a shadow, but as an equal. A man who had chosen his place and been chosen in return. That night, when the hall was quiet and the torches burned low, Meryn turned to Ethan. She told him that her mother had trusted him, and now she did as well. She said that together they would lead, not as ruler and soldier alone, but as partners. Ethan looked at her, and though he spoke no grand words, his presence was answer enough. The kingdom's future lay before them, and they would face it side by side. The whisper of the old queen lived on, not in sorrow, but in the strength of the new age that had begun.